Hello folks, I'm starting a portrait and wanted to show you a little bit of my process, how I do portrait work. I'm going to be painting direct on the canvas. Sometimes I'll do drawings beforehand and paint from my drawing, but at this moment I'm going to go ahead and go straight on canvas and kind of show beginning to end the way that I do this. So I'm starting with acrylic paint. It has a better drying time than the oils, and that makes it easier to kind of push and pull with the drawing on canvas and get the values right, break down the larger shapes, things like that. So the first thing I'm doing is kind of getting a sense of the angle, and we got his head tilted a little bit this way. This is going to be my top. Put my bottom about here, and this is going to be sort of my center line. And one of the advantages of starting this with acrylic is that it's going to be very easy to get my tone down and begin to push and pull with white acrylic as well, and really work on the general forms. A lot of times what I'm doing is starting out with the Loomis or Reilly method. So I'll start out with my circle. And since he sort of tilted this direction, I'm gonna cut in my sides a little bit. And most of you are probably somewhat familiar with this. Typically what we're doing is slicing the sides off, getting the hairline, getting the nose, eyebrow line would come about here, and equidistant coming down to the bottom of the chin, which pushes it up a tiny bit, which is fine. The drawing process can sometimes be a little bit messy, which is fine with me. Most important is that we kind of have that same angle with everything that we're doing. Of course, the ears come here, between the eyebrows and the nose line, and eyebrows here. The eyes are going to be about 1/3 of the way down between the eyebrow and the nose line. Start to block that in. Want to get a sense of some of these big darker shapes. And as you can see, I'm using quite a bit of water at the moment. And I'm using a bigger brush for the sake of just getting the entire thing in. This is going to be the bottom of the nose, sort of the shadow there, side of the nose. Chin is typically going to come up and meet with this outside line here. There's going to be an oval that is called the mound of the mouth and helps to define smile lines and things like this. And as I think I've mentioned before, portrait painting is a large part of what I do. We also have a line that connects this edge of the nose to the ears on both sides. We have the nose coming up here, the edge of the nostrils typically land at about the same line as the eyes. Space between the eyes is about one eye width. So we can begin to get some basic shapes in that regard as well. He's tilted slightly to the left. So I want to make sure that I get this side of the head just a bit wider from the center line to the outside. Top of the cranium, sides. And this head is about 3/4 of actual size. which I think tends to be about right. And that means, depending on the amount of the body that the portrait should have, the size of the canvas will vary also. Theoretically, a portrait of this size, 3/4, could go on a somewhat smaller canvas, but it's nice to have a little bit of air around the face. One example of a smaller canvas size, and I think the head size is actually smaller here too. This is a portrait that I did of Pierre Boulez. If anybody is a fan of atonal music or contemporary avant-garde orchestra music, Pierre Boulez is one of the greats, one of my favorite composers, producers of music ever, really. If you're not familiar, then I would highly recommend Notations from Pierre Boulez. This is an example of the portrait taking up pretty much the entire canvas, from shoulders to the top of the head. Takes up the entire thing. In this one, however, I want to include a little bit more background, and so I decided to go with a touch larger canvas size. If we were to do a half portrait to the waist, then, and we're still looking at 3/4, then the canvas size is going to have to increase to go 3/4 to the knee or mid thigh, then increases again, and full length, then it's going to have to be large enough, obviously, to accommodate the feet. And this man has quite a round face, so I want to make sure that I'm getting that roundness as well in there. So the ear, side of the head. There's going to be a little bit more light coming here. At that eye socket and top of the cheekbones, there's a little bit more light coming in the front. Typically with oil painting, somebody would do this with oil instead of acrylic. I find that with the watered down acrylic, it works fine, and once it dries, we're actually holding on to the initial brush strokes a little bit more than we would if we were working with oil paint from the beginning and blending that stuff out, especially if we're coming back over the top of the dried acrylic with some thinner oil layers, avoiding going too heavy with the impasto paint, and of course this will technically not be a true impasto painting simply because of a day of drying time for the acrylic paint. I just find that sometimes if I'm struggling with the drawing a little bit or want to do a little bit more of the pushing and pulling, then this is for me a better way to go. Of course, if you're following somebody like Stephen Bauman or Scott Waddell or these guys who are absolute masters of their portrait painting, or Renzo, they can, well, Scott Waddell and Stephen Bauman are both working from drawings also. I think Renzo just goes for it. But that guy is, amazing. All three of those guys are amazing. There's a bunch of other fantastic portrait painters on YouTube that probably do a better job than me, but this is my channel, so here we go. And I do like to take this opportunity to establish those shadows, lights and darks, things like that, which of course is part of the reason that I use so much water. It's because I want to make sure that anything that I'm laying down, I can still see basically what I have going. Try to match those values as close as you can to what's in the original. I try to avoid really using pure white anywhere. And the entire background is gonna take some tone as well. I'm not 100% sure what I'm gonna put in the background yet. If it's gonna be a basic sort of Rembrandt background, or if it's going to be something a little more surrealistic or realistic, nuanced, whatever it might be. I'm not 100% sure yet. And so I'm going to leave that for the moment. Although a small amount of tone is probably a good way to start it. Setting a little bit to the left of center of the canvas so that there's space. One thing I'm thinking, this person comes from Arizona, or I know him from Arizona, and I had an idea of doing a nice Tucson sunset in the background, so I want to leave that option open in case it does come to that. So we're going to go ahead and lay some tone back here just to kill that white. I think the one danger of a backlit sunset might be that the lighting scenario for the portrait becomes possibly a little confusing unless we're assuming he's sitting in front of a sunset under artificial light but I'm not sure if I want to try to justify or play with that sort of ambiguity. And again, lots of water. If this was with oil paint, then we'd be using turpentine with burnt umber, or raw umber. Raw umber is also a good color to use. I think this entire painting process can definitely become a little bit boring to watch and tedious, but I haven't quite figured out how to do sped up video like the young folks do. One of these days I'll do my research and I'll figure out how that works. But for the moment, I have more painting to do than time to research video techniques, I guess. Obviously, I like to keep this texture. I like to have a lot of texture to work with. I think it lends to the naturalism a little bit. And we're not going to go full abstract. But having some of that texture in there definitely lends itself to a natural environment. And one of the things, if you're interested on what I'm using here, is a canvas board. I got in the habit of using these when I was moving around a lot and traveled a lot. I got used to working on these smaller flat boards that I could fit in a backpack, a travel, hiking, camping backpack, or in a suitcase, or in small boxes, stuff like this. And so I kind of got used to painting on these boards. And this picture, I'm in Germany now. And like I said, the person I'm painting this for lives in Arizona, in USA. Or the family that I'm painting it for, rather, I should say, lives in the USA. And so this will probably be traveling back with me in a suitcase, or suitcase in this case. And I want to have a way to transport it relatively easily. And so that's why I'm still using the board for these pictures that are kind of coming overseas with me. And if I were to send it, the advantage is also that it's quite easy to send paintings that are done on these boards. So it's important to line things up to get a clear sense of exactly where certain parts of the composition are in relation to everything else. And this is the idea of the plumb line. So we're working with, at this point, working with plumb line a little bit. We're working with value, which, if you're not familiar, value is basically the relationships between light and dark in the picture. Here I'm doing the same thing. This shirt's going to end up being quite light, but I want to begin that with a little bit of tone, because this is not going to be the brightest element of the painting at all. And the brightest element is going to be the highlight at the top of the head, a little bit of the highlight at the top of the nose, and a little bit of highlight on this cheek. And so everything else should have at least a ground layer down. I want to try to fill in all those little holes in the canvas. Of course, when I'm working with these canvases, with these canvas boards, I am not taking it straight out of the package. I'm adding 2 or 3 layers of gesso in between. Yep, fill in all those little gaps, fill in all those holes. In between each layer of gesso, I sand it down a little bit to get rid of any high points, get rid of any sand, anything like that. Get it smooth as possible. Do that 3 times. And then you have a surface that's workable, that's smooth, and will will take the paint very nicely. And the acrylic, I think, helps to fill in those holes. If the paint skips over the holes when they're still white, then it's going to be very obvious. If the paint skips over a hole that's filled with tone, then it's got color, it's got tone, it's got value, it's going to disappear. It's another added benefit of doing an imprimatura initially of the entire canvas. And I suppose one of the disadvantages of the acrylic as opposed to oil is that this is already drying, and so we're not able to necessarily do the rub out technique that a lot of the classical painters were doing with the imprimatura, which is basically means getting the imprimatura in as a ground layer over the entire canvas, coming back with a rag, and sort of wiping out the highlights. With this technique that I'm using now, it's a little bit different. And so what I'm trying to do basically is get some tone on the entire canvas and then start coming back in with white. And because I don't want to have necessarily pure white showing, and I do want some tone down everywhere, then I will glaze with water a little bit of this brown back on top of areas of highest light. And so it really kind of does become a sort of push and pull technique. And like I said before too, I enjoy that part of the process. I like the cutting in, I like the beautiful things that can happen with beginning to get those different layers working with each other and against each other. So get some of that head reestablished there. This part of the neck. And like I said at the beginning, this also allows me to adjust the drawing if I see anything that's off or not quite working the way that I want it to, then I can address that in this little bit rougher, messier way. And at the end of the day, get a relatively accurate drawing from the outset. Because this is going to be so light down here, I don't want to go too dark with this edge, separating the two. If it gets too dark, then this huge light area really begins to predominate. And I'm thinking with this, I'd rather keep the background on the lighter side. I don't want to go too dark with it. And to be honest, I considered straightening the head out a little bit more, but I think that this angle, the way he's angling his head, says a lot about his disposition and about his love for his wife who took the picture, things like that. And so I want to maintain a little bit of that. So, now at this point, if I were to go back in with my white right away, then it's going to blend pretty strongly with the brown, and that's not necessarily what I want to have happen. Again, for my style, for my technique, for my aesthetic, I do like to have a little bit more of that brushwork showing, which often comes with a little bit choppier use of the lights and darks. On this photo that I'm using for reference, there is a clear highlight coming from this direction. That's the sun. But there is a lot of reflected light coming up into this area too. And when I get to something like that, the reflected light, where it can sometimes have the effect of flattening out certain areas, I will definitely take more artistic license and decide for the picture what's going to give me a most three-dimensional effect. So which parts of that light to use, which parts of that light not to use. And I think that ends up giving a better result, because ultimately the three-dimensionality of the form, the likeness to the person being painted, are the most important things, and not a slavish accuracy from the photograph itself. I do like using photo references. I went to school for illustration, where there's zero taboo with using photographic references. In fact, it's par for the course. It's part of the industry of illustration, or at least in the old days, old school illustration. I graduated from high school in 1990, and so when I was going to school for illustration, it was before computers were being used. Everything was done by hand. There was no computer work at all, much less photo bashing, much less AI or anything like that. It was basically come up with an idea, find photo references for what you can, make the rest up out of your head, and go from there. And I think this lack of taboo around illustration was very important for me, and very beneficial. I think very fine art painters are missing out on a very very good tool when they decide not to allow the use of photographs. And of course, doing fantasy illustration, there's a whole lot that's done without the use of photographs as well. And sometimes you can see when I'm using photos, when not. Obviously, the goal is to hide that as much as possible and make a picture that's convincing enough that the viewer has only believes it's realistic and doesn't think about, did it come from a photograph or not come from a photograph anymore. And it's just simply a beautiful painting. I'm just toning this a little bit more to try to hide this edge a touch more. I don't want to obliterate the edge. There definitely needs to be a tonal difference between background and the shirt. Like I said before, I just don't want that to take predominance. That should be a secondary aspect of the picture. And a lot of times the best way to do that is to try to make tonal similarity and color temperature contrast. And of course, when doing this, we might call this the ugly middle stage, where it's beginning to take shape, but because it's not completely established, can sometimes tend to look a little bit on the ugly side, I guess. So, eyebrows. I want to make sure the top of the head is really as high up as it needs to be. I think that works pretty well. Another good way to measure, other than using the thirds, from Loomis and Reilly, is to measure halfway to the eyes. And so I'm going to do that and try to see if I'm accurate. Oh, it looks pretty good. I think I have that in there relatively well. And if there's going to be some changes later on, then that's going to be fine. At that point, it's small adjustments rather than the drawing of it, the drawing itself. And this stage here is is definitely what I would consider to be the drawing stage. I'm not going into too much detail, just trying to get placements, broader shapes, and a little bit of that beginning of the form. So I believe the ugly middle stage has been achieved. We'll get a little bit of the eye. It's definitely a little bit more at the corner on this side, and more in the center on this side. You want to make sure that the eyes line up as well. And of course, some of the acrylic paint can be rubbed back. I don't want to get too into that right now, because that's not the point of this. More important is the beginning of likeness and as much accuracy as possible. And like I said, his head is tilted just a little bit to his left. And so I want to make sure that we're pushing this side of the head in just a touch, pulling this side of the head out just a touch, making sure that the width from the ear to the center line, to the nose, and when I say center line, I don't mean the center of the head, I mean the center of the face. And so this line that comes the middle of the chin, between the two front teeth, middle of the nose, arch of the nose, through the forehead, and up to, and in this case it would be bowing just a touch up here, just a tiny touch. And so the point of the cranium is actually going to be a little more in there. This side is probably a little too sharp. And we're also seeing a little bit more of the side of his face on this side. And it's still not much. This thin line here is really what I'd consider to be the side of the face. This is the side of the face over here, and you see it's a little bit thinner. Not much, but a little. Another great thing to use is the planes of the head from Asaro, from John Asaro, who, amazingly enough, there's a gallery in Tucson, Arizona that I stumbled into. Most of the work in Tucson is Western, and there's some very good underground artists there too, for sure. But mostly Western. Amazing landscapes, some really good portrait painters, lots of Grand Canyon, lots of desert landscapes, things like that. But I stumbled into a gallery who happens to be one of the main dealers for John Assaro's paintings. And I already know John Assaro, his work, as well as the Planes of the Head. But I walked into this gallery and they had huge 2.5 meter tall, 1.5 to 2 meter wide John Assaro nudes, ballerinas, all the cool stuff that he does, the amazing color palettes and color combinations that he uses. Just, I think, the absolute master of color usage and those experiments with color combinations that I've never seen anybody else come close. Andrew Kadima does a really good job of doing stuff like that as well, to be honest. I'm a big fan of Andrew Kadima's work. John Assaro is the first painter that I have seen that really did stuff like that. And anyways, walking into this gallery in Tucson, Arizona, and seeing these things on the wall it just totally took me by surprise, blew me away. It was like walking into a modern art museum. So, I think the actual distance between the eyebrow and the eye itself is a little bit, maybe a little bit off. This is always a thing for me, is that I put the I always assume that the eye is much higher than it really is, much lower, closer to the tip of the nose in real life. This distance is usually not as great as I assume it's going to be, and this distance is usually much larger than I assume it's going to be. So that's something that I always need to kind of pay attention to and watch myself on. And there's a few of those little points that I know about myself. I know about my strengths and weaknesses, my habits, frequently repeated mistakes. And one of the reasons I like this tilted head is that it's a challenge to make a symmetrical face that's not upright, at least for me. So, ugly middle achieved, huh? So I think I'm gonna call that good for right now, and let this dry just a touch before I begin with that white. So, have a good day. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video for some white. Thanks.